The late October evening had a way of insisting upon silence, not the comfortable silence of a country drawing-room where knitting needles clack in gentle rhythm, but the stern, deliberate silence of an empty hall, polished marble gleaming faintly under the flicker of wall sconces. It was in such a hall, precisely at a time when the household clock, an ostentatious Jacobean monstrosity with more dials than necessary, struck 13, that Lord Peter Wimsey first became aware that something was amiss. He had arrived at Brierley Manor under the flimsiest of pretexts, summoned by a cousin of the victim who seemed constitutionally incapable of phrasing a request without apology. "It is nothing, Lord Peter, merely a trivial disturbance. But your opinion might be of some comfort," she had said, as though the suggestion of murder were impolite to utter. Wimsey, of course, suspected immediately that the trivial disturbance was the sort that involved either murder, madness, or both, though he permitted himself no outward show of anxiety. Such things were rarely conducive to effective observation. The first clue was, as it often is, absurdly minute. Footsteps. Not the ordinary cautious tread of a night wanderer, but deliberate, measured, almost musical footsteps upon the marble flooring of the long, echoing hall. Wimsey paused at the threshold of the drawing-room, one boot poised like a conductor's baton, listening. "Curious," he murmured, mostly to himself, a faint smile twitching at the corner of his mouth. "The hall is long enough for an echo, yet these steps carry no return note. Either the floor has been waxed with uncommon skill, or the walker is in possession of a muffling device so intricate I should imagine the Patent Office would be interested." The second anomaly was a candle, still warm, set precariously in a silver sconce by the fireplace. Its flame had been extinguished very recently, but no soot marked the wall behind it, suggesting it had not been moved in the ordinary manner. Wimsey knelt to inspect the wax drip. "Ah," he said, tapping a gloved finger against the solidified globule. "Here we have evidence of speed. The candle was almost certainly blown out by a hand in motion, not a careless puff. Noteworthy, though I dare say the police will find it perplexing." A faint scent lingered in the room, a mixture of melted wax and something else, a metallic tang that he associated more readily with freshly turned earth than with London drawing-rooms. Wimsey inclined his head. It was subtle, but anyone with an ear attuned to human absurdity might detect the metaphorical scream hidden beneath the civility of the manner. From somewhere above came the dull echo of laughter, or perhaps the mockery of an empty corridor. Wimsey frowned. He had little interest in the supernatural, yet he noted with private amusement that the evening's theatrics were suitably Gothic. A house that seemed alive, or at least intent, upon suggesting it, and the clock that insisted, without the faintest apology, upon striking 13. He rose and dusted the knees of his trousers, turning to the awaiting housekeeper. "Madame," he said, in the careful, arch tone reserved for situations where one wishes to appear both concerned and unruffled, "you will forgive my inquiry, but is it customary for Brierley Manor to possess a clock capable of striking 13? Or have you recently acquired a penchant for the dramatic?" The housekeeper's lips pressed thin. "The clock. It has always struck 13 at midnight, sir, eh? My mother insisted upon it." Her voice trembled ever so slightly, as though even the very mention of 13 risked summoning the unknown. Wimsey's lips twitched. "Indeed," he said mildly, "one must always respect a family tradition, even if it does tempt fate or police constables into sudden retirement." He lingered, silent for a moment, permitting the candle's warm glow to illuminate the solemnity of the room, as though by observing one could draw the secrets from the shadows. And, as he did, he made a mental note. Footsteps that made no echo, a candle extinguished with deliberate haste, a metallic scent too sharp for mere domesticity, and a clock striking the impossible hour. All minor details. Yet to Wimsey, minor details were seldom insignificant. Already the game had begun. Whimsy began his inquiries with the staff, starting with the housekeeper, a formidable woman named Mrs. Fenwick, whose prim composure betrayed only the faintest tremor whenever she glanced at the clock. Her hands, folded with the precision of a regimented life, refused to tremble further, though her voice wavered in the soft undercurrent of suppressed anxiety. "I assure you, Lord Peter, nothing unusual has occurred. The household runs as it always has. All doors were locked last night. The kitchen staff retired at their usual hour. The gardener returned from the stables promptly at 10. She delivered this recital with the solemnity of a parish register, as if the mere repetition of facts could ward off calamity. Whimsy nodded politely, making no comment. He proceeded through the corridors, noting small inconsistencies. A tapestry slightly askew, the faint trace of mud on the usually spotless parquet, a candlestick not quite in alignment with its twin on the opposite wall. Each anomaly he catalogued mentally, not because it seemed significant on its own, but because, as he often reminded himself, the improbable is frequently the disguise of the deliberate. In the servants' hall, he found the footman, a nervous youth named Perkins, polishing silver with a meticulousness that bordered on obsessive. Whimsy watched him for a moment, observing the slight hesitations, the pauses in rhythm, the tiny signs of distraction. "Pray, Perkins," he said casually, "did you hear anything last night? A door closing, a voice perhaps? Anything unusual?" Perkins shook his head, eyes wide. "No, my lord, nothing at all. I went to bed as usual." Whimsy raised a brow. "As usual? And the main hall, sir? Did your nocturnal wanderings take you near the clock?" The young man flushed. I don't usually go that far, my lord. But I did hear something. Footsteps. Yes, I think. But I thought it was Master Harold returning late. Nothing else." "Indeed," Whimsy murmured, the ghost of a smile playing upon his lips. "Curious, the two individuals might hear the same sound differently. Or perhaps only one actually heard it. Human perception is notoriously selective, Perkins." From the kitchen came the faint clatter of a ladle and the murmur of someone speaking to themselves. Whimsy noted the tone and the hesitation of the voice, registering the cadence as he moved onward. Each person he encountered insisted with steadfast conviction that nothing at all had occurred. And yet each repetition introduced a subtle divergence, a hesitation here, a contradiction there, a scent of fear or deception just perceptible to the trained ear. By the time he returned to the main hall, Whimsy had pieced together a preliminary map of movements, though incomplete and imperfect. He knew, for instance, that the gardener had made an unusual detour behind the west wing, that a chambermaid had lingered too long near the eastern staircase, and that the butler had, curiously, avoided the hall entirely during the night. None of these were outright evidence, yet the juxtaposition of alibis and absences formed a pattern. A pattern, he reflected, that would make sense only in the light of the truth, once it revealed itself in its own time. Whimsy's eyes lingered again on the candle sconce, now cold, yet the wax still holding its distorted shape. He made a mental note. The speed and force required to extinguish it suggested more than casual motion, yet the placement indicated a deliberate effort to leave no mark. He smiled faintly to himself. A minor detail indeed, but one that might yet unravel the tale if properly aligned with the testimony he intended to gather. He retired briefly to the library, ostensibly to peruse a volume of obscure ecclesiastical history, but in reality to allow his mind to assemble the fragments he had collected. There was rhythm in human behavior, even when it pretended to be erratic. People, he mused, reveal their intentions in the smallest gestures. The dust on a banister, the alignment of a chair, the way a foot taps beneath a table. And in these fragments, hidden like tiny runes in a manuscript, lay the pathway to understanding the night's disturbance. By the time the household had settled into the uneasy quiet of late evening, Whimsy was already forming hypotheses. Not guesses, for guesses required no evidence, but carefully considered possibilities that could later be tested. Footsteps with no echo, candles extinguished with deliberate haste, contradictory, alibis and the faint metallic scent all pointed toward someone moving with purpose, yet careful enough to leave only whispers behind. He allowed himself a faint chuckle as he considered the potential amusement awaiting him. The evening promised more than mere disturbance. It promised revelation, and that, as he well knew, was infinitely preferable to suspense alone. The following morning brought no relief from the peculiar tension that seemed to have settled upon Briarley Manor. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp leaves from the surrounding parkland, yet inside the house, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken questions. Whimsy moved among the residents with his characteristic light-footed deliberation, observing without overt scrutiny, yet noting everything. The way a lady's glove rested slightly askew on the banister, the hesitation of a servant's hand as it offered tea, the faint scuff mark on the parquet that had not been there the night before. It was during breakfast that the first clear lead emerged. Harold Briarley, the victim's nephew, arrived in a flurry of agitation, his face unusually flushed and eyes darting as though trying to avoid the scrutiny of the entire room. He greeted Whimsy with a perfunctory nod, muttering an apology for being late, and proceeded to make his way to the far end of the table. Whimsy noted the subtle tremor in his hands as he poured coffee, a detail that might have been dismissed by an ordinary observer, yet which suggested a mind distracted or burdened. "Mr. Briarley," Whimsy began, in that light, arch tone which seemed to render interrogations polite. "A curious question, if I may intrude. Did you retire early last night, or were your wanderings prolonged by a necessity of business?" Harold's flush deepened. I retired at my usual hour, Lord Peter. Nothing unusual occurred, I assure you." Whimsy inclined his head slightly, as though weighing the sincerity of the statement against the evidence already at hand. "Curious," he said softly, more to himself than to anyone else. "The usual hour, yet the servants report a presence on the upper landing long past the clock striking 13. Odd, is it not?" The young man's fingers tightened around the coffee cup. He stammered, I must have been asleep. Really, Whimsy's smile was thin and knowing. "Sleep, perhaps, or a diversion. One never truly knows, does one? Yet such details, seemingly insignificant, have a curious way of assembling themselves into a rather coherent narrative when observed closely." It was in the drawing-room afterward, as Whimsy moved from window to window, examining the latch of one that had been left slightly ajar, that he began to notice the pattern emerging among the minor contradictions he had collected. A servant insisting on having locked a door that bore the faintest scratch of a key, a misplaced rug that had been walked upon in the dead of night, and the echo, or lack thereof, of the mysterious footsteps, all began to form a lattice of evidence. Mrs. Fenwick hovered near, officious yet anxious. "I've checked everything again, Lord Peter. The doors are as they always are. The servants all swear they know nothing. We are entirely at a loss." Whimsy's eyes glimmered with mild amusement. "Ah, but nothing is ever entirely at a loss, Mrs. Fenwick. One must only know how to look. A lie, for example, is rarely as clean as the teller imagines. The smallest hesitation, averted gaze, or improperly aligned object often speaks more loudly than words." By midday, a visitor arrived, whose presence threatened to shift the focus entirely. Mrs. Briarley's distant cousin, an antiquarian named Mr. Strathmore, presented himself with a curious air of officious concern. He spoke at length about minor debts and familial obligations, yet his eyes betrayed a sharper interest in the events of the previous night. He lingered over the notion of responsibility, hinting at grievances that might easily be construed as motive, yet refrained from outright accusation. Whimsy listened, eyes never leaving the man's face, noting the subtle twitch of the upper lip when the word debt was mentioned. the faint tightening of the jaw when the footsteps were alluded to. It was, as Whimsy often remarked to himself, the interplay of words and body that revealed more than speech alone. Mr. Strathmore appeared a perfectly ordinary man, yet his ordinary nature contained within it the potential for extraordinary duplicity, a truth Whimsy stored carefully in the recesses of his mind. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Whimsy withdrew briefly to the library, where he laid out his observations in methodical sequence. The young nephew, the anxious servants, the ostensibly concerned relative, all fit into a tentative chronology that still held gaps. Footsteps without echo, a candle extinguished with precise speed, the ajar window, and the metallic scent all suggested deliberate movement, yet the identity of the mover remained hidden behind a wall of politeness and feigned ignorance. Whimsy's thoughts returned to the candle, still lingering in his memory. The force required to extinguish it so cleanly implied strength, purpose, and an awareness of observation. It was the mark of someone accustomed to action in secrecy, and yet, by the careful collection of these small details, Whimsy was beginning to map the pattern of that secret action. By the close of day, he had constructed a mental lattice linking each minor irregularity. The house, in its ostentatious civility, had offered him all it possessed in the form of half-truths, misaligned objects, and subtle traces of movement. And already, though he revealed nothing, he sensed the first faint outlines of the red herring, someone whose motives were obvious to all, yet whose guilt might be far more intricate than any observer could imagine. The following morning, a crisp wind blew through the tall oaks surrounding Brierley Manor, carrying with it the faint tang of frost and the sharp bite of early winter. Inside, the household carried on with a polite semblance of routine, though Whimsy noted immediately that the rhythm was fractured. Tea poured mechanically, silverware rattling too loudly, footsteps hesitant where they should have been confident. He moved among them with deliberate lightness, questioning in his usual arch, courteous fashion, all the while cataloguing mannerisms, hesitations, and those infinitesimal signs of unease that ordinary eyes would miss. He returned first to Harold Brierley, who had spent the previous day pacing the drawing-room in anxious bursts. "Your uncle was fond of punctuality," Whimsy remarked casually as he leaned against the mantel, a finger tracing the delicate pattern of marble. Yet the servants claimed to have heard footsteps long after midnight in a corridor one would scarcely traverse without purpose. "Did you, perchance, emerge from slumber to observe something untoward?" Harold's flush deepened, and he set down his teacup with a clink that seemed louder than necessary. I cannot recall, Lord Peter. I was asleep, or I thought I was." His hesitation, however, bespoke more than mere forgetfulness, and Whimsy made a mental note. Moving through the hall, he scrutinized the positions of the furniture and the arrangement of the rugs, each a small misalignment suggesting movement or disturbance. The West Wing corridor bore traces of mud, faint and nearly imperceptible, yet its presence contradicted the housekeeper's account of the gardener's route. The window in the eastern corridor remained ajar, though Mrs. Fenwick had insisted on its being secured. Whimsy's eyes gleamed with mild amusement. These were minor discrepancies, but they hinted at a deliberate choreography, a hidden hand that had moved through the manor with careful intent. Later, in the servants' hall, Whimsy addressed Perkins, the footman, whose nervous fidgeting and distracted polishing betrayed more than his words. "You are quite certain that no one passed through the upper landing last night?" Whimsy inquired softly, yet with a pointed weight behind the inquiry. Perkins swallowed, his knuckles whitening on the silver. I heard nothing unusual, my lord, only, perhaps, footsteps, but I thought it was Master Harold. I'm certain of nothing." "Indeed," Whimsy murmured, tapping his chin thoughtfully. "Certainty is a rare companion of truth, Perkins. One must always measure what is heard against what is seen, and what is seen against what is impossible. The interplay of these measurements often yields a far clearer picture than the eye alone can provide." By midday, the household had assembled in the drawing-room under the guise of ordinary conversation. Wimsey observed the subtle interactions. The distant cousin, Mr. Strathmore, lingering slightly behind, listening more intently than he spoke. The chambermaid nervously rearranging cushions as though they might conceal secrets. Harold Brierly, fidgeting with a handkerchief, eyes flitting toward the ajar window with guilt or fear, or some mixture of both. As they spoke, Wimsey introduced what seemed trivial inquiries, each seemingly unrelated to the case, but designed to probe, to unsettle, to reveal patterns in behavior. "Do the clocks in each room chime precisely together?" he asked lightly, as though discussing household aesthetics. "And the curtains, do they hang evenly? One often finds a great deal about character and habit in the alignment of domestic details." The room stiffened slightly, the household acutely aware that their every response would be noted, catalogued, and judged. Each answer, though seemingly innocent, added to Wimsey's ever-growing lattice of observation. A mismatched curtain, a clock striking slightly too early, a servant pausing ever so briefly before answering. Each anomaly was a thread in the complex weave he was beginning to discern. By afternoon, Wimsey had begun reconstructing the sequence of events with meticulous care. The footsteps that made no echo, the candle extinguished with deliberate speed, the metallic scent lingering faintly in the corridors, the ajar window, the misplaced rug, all now formed a tentative chronology. Each anomaly suggested movement and intention, yet the identity of the actor remained hidden behind polite obfuscation and the nervous rituals of the household. Wimsey allowed himself a quiet smile, the faint curl of amusement tugging at his lips. The game was well underway. The obvious suspect, the agitated young nephew, the dour relative with a keen interest in family obligations, might appear to all as the guilty party. Yet Wimsey, as ever, recognized the danger of superficial clarity. Truth, he mused, rarely reveals itself in a single glance. It emerges from the patient alignment of detail, timing, and human frailty. And so he waited, observing with keen, detached amusement, allowing the household to reveal itself in increments, each gesture and slip providing another clue to the puzzle he was already beginning to see an outline. The red herring, he suspected, was imminent, but the first glimpse of it would be carefully orchestrated, for in a game such as this, even deception must follow its own internal logic. As the afternoon waned, the household settled into a brittle quiet, broken only by the occasional clatter of a teacup or the distant creak of the main staircase under some unnoticed weight. Wimsey, however, found the stillness productive. He moved from room to room, retracing the previous night's footprints in his mind, matching each observation to the statements he had collected, and scrutinizing every incongruity with the patience of a scholar reading a particularly obstinate manuscript. He lingered before the ajar window in the eastern corridor, peering through the glass at the fading light, noting the shadows of trees stretching across the lawn. The window's catch bore faint scratches, almost imperceptible, yet they suggested a hand applied with purpose rather than carelessness. Near the sill, a trace of soil had been left behind, small yet telling. Wimsey crouched, inspecting it closely. The pattern indicated not a single passage, but at least two movements, deliberate and cautious, the second leaving a barely perceptible trail over the first. His thoughts returned to the candle in the main hall. The wax's deformation, still preserved in its solidified state, indicated not mere proximity, but a motion executed with speed and certainty. Wimsey considered the combination. The footsteps, the open window, the metallic scent that lingered faintly in the hall. Each was minor in isolation, yet together they suggested a careful orchestration. Someone had moved through the manor deliberately, leaving a trail almost invisible to the untrained eye. A sudden interruption drew his attention, the sound of the front door opening. Mr. Strathmore entered, his expression a blend of polite concern and subtle calculation, the very embodiment of civility masking scrutiny. He carried himself with the assurance of a man used to observation, yet Whimsy detected the slight tension in his shoulders, the barely perceptible pause before greeting the footman. "Lord Peter," he began, voice measured, "I trust your investigations have begun to bear fruit. I hope I am not intruding." Whimsy inclined his head, archly polite. "Not at all, Mr. Strathmore. I was merely considering the manifold ways in which a house, however respectable, can betray its occupants to the observant eye." He allowed the statement to linger, then added casually, "Curious, is it not, how footprints vanish and windows may be opened without a sound?" Strathmore's eyes flickered, a micro-expression that passed in the span of a heartbeat. Whimsy noted it with quiet interest. "Indeed, it is curious," Strathmore replied, recovering. "Yet the ordinary explanations are usually sufficient. One mustn't imagine mischief where there is merely accident or neglect." "True," Whimsy agreed, letting the word hang in the air. "Yet one must also consider that accident and neglect are often the preferred masks of those who act with intention." He sipped from his teacup, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Later, as the household dispersed for their afternoon occupations, Whimsy revisited the hall and the West Wing corridor. He measured distances, considered the echo, or absence thereof, of imagined footsteps, and compared the times each servant claimed to have been elsewhere. The inconsistencies were subtle. A delay here, a pause there, a claimed position contradicted by the evidence of scuffed floors or slightly disturbed furnishings. Individually, each discrepancy was negligible. Collectively, they suggested a careful but imperfect plan executed under the cloak of ordinary routine. By evening, Whimsy had begun to formulate the outline of a hypothesis. Someone had moved with purpose through the manor, executing actions intended to remain unnoticed, yet leaving behind traces that only a patient and precise observer could detect. The young nephew's nervousness, the anxious gestures of the chambermaid, the minor scratches on window catches, and the trace of soil on the corridor floor all pointed toward a movement orchestrated to mislead. He allowed himself the smallest wry smile. The red herring was becoming apparent, a figure whose motive seemed obvious and whose agitation drew attention, yet whose apparent guilt masked a more intricate reality. Whimsy did not speak of it, for there was no need. The beauty of such a revelation, he reflected, lay in allowing the apparent solution to linger, enticing the observer to assume they understood, while the true design remained concealed. As night fell, he retreated to the library, laying out his observations in meticulous order. Each minor anomaly, the echoless footsteps, the displaced rug, the ajar window, the metallic scent, the candle extinguished with deliberate motion, formed a lattice of implication, and within that lattice, faint though it was, the shape of the red herring began to take form. All that remained was to test the theory against the human elements, the hesitations, the half-truths, and the gestures that spoke louder than words. Whimsy leaned back, fingers steepled beneath his chin, and allowed the faint thrill of anticipation to settle over him. The game was advancing, each piece falling into its place, and soon, he knew, the masquerade of civility would begin to unravel, one subtle observation at a time. That evening, the manor assumed an almost theatrical quiet, the kind that seemed to press upon one's thoughts as much as the thick velvet curtains pressed against the windows. Whimsy walked the halls again, pausing at the points he had marked in his mental map, retracing the possible movements of the night before. Each corridor, each door, each carefully aligned object told a story, if one knew how to read it. He paused by the ajar window in the eastern corridor, kneeling briefly to inspect the catch once more. The faint scratches were deliberate, yes, but there was another detail, a barely perceptible smudge along the inner sill that suggested a hand gripping there, not lightly, but with a certain tension. Whimsy straightened, his eyes narrowing. That motion was too precise to be accidental, and yet too cautious to be intended for anyone other than the observer. The candle in the main hall had been extinguished in a similar manner, its wax still holding the deformed shape of an abrupt hand movement. These were gestures executed with purpose, but not without consideration for the consequences. Someone careful, deliberate, and aware of the scrutiny their actions might attract. As he moved through the West Wing corridor, his attention was drawn to the faint smudge of soil that trailed along the edge of the parquet. The pattern indicated more than one movement, as if a person had retraced their own steps in a deliberate path. Whimsy crouched to inspect it, noting the subtle differences in pressure. The first pass was cautious, the second with greater urgency. A pattern was emerging, though incomplete, and it suggested someone attempting to manage the perception of their movement, to mislead any casual observer. Whimsy allowed himself a quiet smile. This was the work of a mind attuned to precision and discretion. The traces were minute, yet telling, and in their arrangement, he could already sense the contours of a more complex design. Someone had moved with purpose, and yet their motive remained carefully concealed beneath the surface of household civility. Later, he convened a brief, seemingly casual discussion with Harold Brierly in the library, touching upon points that appeared trivial: the alignment of chairs, the chiming of clocks, the order of books on a shelf. Harold responded politely, but with a noticeable stiffness, his gaze drifting toward the western corridor as if anticipating an unseen question. Each answer, each hesitation, revealed more than the words themselves. Whimsy catalogued these micro-expressions with care, noting which gestures aligned with previous observations and which contradicted them. When Mrs. Fenwick appeared with evening tea, her movements were precise, almost rehearsed. Whimsy observed the placement of the silver tray, the positioning of cups, and the subtle tremor in her fingers as she adjusted a sugar bowl. "Anxious, madam?" he asked gently, though the remark was more a test than a question. She forced a polite smile, replied that she had only the usual household cares, but the subtle stiffening of her posture betrayed a deeper concern. By the time the household had withdrawn for the night, Whimsy had accumulated a wealth of small, apparently unrelated observations. Footsteps with no echo, an extinguished candle, the ajar window, traces of soil, hesitating gestures, and minor contradictions in testimony. Taken individually, each was insignificant. Taken together, they formed a lattice of suggestion, pointing toward deliberate action concealed beneath the guise of ordinary domestic life. As he retired to the library once more, Whimsy reflected upon the emerging pattern. The evidence pointed to a person accustomed to careful planning, someone who could manipulate both objects and people with subtlety. Yet there was another layer, a psychological nuance, that required attention: the manner in which each household member reacted to suggestion, how fear, guilt, and pride shaped their actions and their willingness to reveal or conceal the truth. Whimsy allowed himself the faintest glimmer of amusement. The obvious suspect, the agitated young nephew, the conscientious housekeeper, the seemingly concerned relative. Each played their role in the tableau, yet none revealed the full truth. And therein lay the challenge and the delight, to trace not merely the visible movement, but the hidden intent, to perceive the unseen architecture of the night's events, and to begin to assemble the full picture of what had transpired in the shadowed corridors of Brierly Manor. The next morning arrived grey and damp, the manor shrouded in mist that seemed to cling stubbornly to the eaves and tree branches, lending the house an even more spectral aspect than the previous evening. Whimsy, ever alert to the subtlest shifts in atmosphere, noted immediately how the mood of the household had stiffened overnight. Voices were quieter, gestures more controlled, and the ordinary rituals of domesticity performed with excessive care. Such minor tensions, he mused, were often more revealing than dramatic outbursts. He began his rounds with the chambermaid, a timid young woman named Elsie, who seemed especially fidgety this morning. Her eyes shifted nervously from whimsy to the window, as though anticipating some unseen scrutiny. "You slept well, Elsie?" he asked lightly, leaning against the doorframe. "Yes, my lord," she murmured, brushing at a tear in the sleeve of her uniform. "Quite well. She paused, her voice faltering, and Whimsy noted the micro-hesitation, cataloguing it with care. "You hesitated," he remarked gently. "Was it concern for the house, or perhaps for someone who moved through it last night?" Elsie bit her lip and looked away. I only meant that I didn't hear anything, my lord." "Nothing at all?" Whimsy's eyes gleamed faintly. "Nothing, you say?" Curiously, there were traces. A candle extinguished with haste, footsteps that left no echo, and soil upon the parquet where it should not have been. Minor things, to be sure, yet such details often tell a story louder than words. He allowed her a moment before moving on, considering each encounter as a thread in the wider tapestry of observation. The servants' nervously rehearsed movements, the slightly ajar window, the subtle smudges on brass fittings, all were pieces of the puzzle, small but interconnected. By late morning, the first real tension appeared among the more senior residents. Harold Brierly, still restless and flushed from yesterday's anxious pacing, received a visitor from the nearby village, a solicitor named Mr. Whitcomb, who spoke at length about legal minutiae, but whose questions seemed carefully calibrated to unsettle. Whimsy observed every inflection, every pause, noting where Harold's responses betrayed hesitation or avoidance. The young man's nervous energy, previously diffuse, was now beginning to coalesce him into a predictable pattern. He flinched at questions about timing, repeated actions, and nocturnal movements, betraying a mind wrestling with half-truths. Meanwhile, Mrs. Fenwick moved among the rooms with her usual efficiency, yet Whimsy detected a tension in her measured steps. She placed objects with precision, yet each gesture was punctuated by a slight overcorrection, a subtle insistence upon order that suggested a fear of disruption. When he asked casually about the arrangement of chairs in the drawing-room the previous night, her eyes flicked toward the ceiling, a small sigh escaping before she replied that everything had been exactly as it should be. By afternoon, Whimsy had begun to test the emerging chronology. He retraced potential paths through the corridors, timing movements and comparing distances. The footmarks, smudges, and disturbances aligned imperfectly with the statements he had gathered, revealing small but telling contradictions. For instance, the chambermaid's claim to have passed the east corridor at a certain time was inconsistent with the damp soil impressions. The gardener's route through the west wing conflicted with the positioning of a moved rug, and Harold's assertion of retiring promptly at 10 did not account for the timing implied by the extinguished candle and its placement in the main hall. These minor inconsistencies, when placed together, suggested careful orchestration. Someone had moved deliberately through the manor, leaving behind traces designed to be overlooked, yet insufficiently meticulous to conceal the entire sequence. Whimsy allowed himself a faint smile at the thought. The cleverness required to execute such a plan without detection was considerable, yet the human tendency toward overcompensation or nervous miscalculation had left openings. By evening, the house seemed to hold its breath. Whimsy convened a brief, casual discussion with Mr. Strathmore, probing lightly about minor household details, clock chimes, curtain alignments, and the positioning of furniture. Strathmore answered politely, yet with the faintest tightness in his voice and a careful avoidance of specifics. Whimsy noted the contrast between his controlled demeanor and the nervous gestures of others, realizing that while Strathmore appeared the picture of calm, the minor lapses elsewhere hinted at a more complex dynamic. A web of deliberate movements interlaced with fear, hesitation, and carefully maintained facades. Whimsy withdrew once more to the library, arranging in his mind the sequence of events, the pattern of movements, and the web of contradictions. Each minor anomaly, the footfalls that left no echo, The displaced rug, the ajar window, the extinguished candle, the faint metallic scent, was now linked to the human element. Gestures of nervousness, glances of avoidance, and the subtle choreography of fear and intent. He allowed himself a quiet, arch thought. The red herring was now fully in view, a figure whose apparent guilt was obvious to all, yet whose role concealed the more intricate machinations of another, mind. And as the night settled again over Brierley Manor, Whimsy felt the first faint contours of the hidden design beginning to emerge, one observation at a time. As night deepened, the manor seemed to grow heavier with its own secrets, the walls themselves almost pressing upon the occupants with a subtle insistence. Whimsy wandered the corridors once more, not in search of immediate revelation, but to let the manifold details of the day settle and align themselves in his mind. Each shadow, each faint scent, each echo or absence of one, contributed to the growing mosaic he was assembling. He paused again by the east corridor window, noting the scratches on the catch and the faint smudge of soil on the sill. There was nothing haphazard in the pattern. It spoke of careful, deliberate movement. Yet the haste suggested by the disrupted wax in the hall candle indicated a second layer, a moment of urgency or distraction, a small imperfection in an otherwise controlled performance. Whimsy smiled to himself. It was in such imperfections that the truth often hid. He moved toward the west wing, his footfalls silent on the parquet, and considered the subtle inconsistencies he had catalogued. The chambermaid's nervous gestures, the young nephew's restless pacing, the housekeeper's meticulous overcorrections, and the distant cousin's barely perceptible tension. Each piece had been observed independently, yet together they suggested choreography, a carefully orchestrated sequence designed to obscure the actor's identity while drawing attention elsewhere. It was during this quiet inspection that a minor but revealing detail caught his eye. The rug in the west corridor, previously thought to be perfectly aligned, bore a slight ridge, indicating it had been shifted deliberately rather than by mere foot traffic. He crouched to inspect it and traced the ridge with a gloved hand, noting that the disturbance was consistent with a hurried step retracing its own path. The implications were immediate. Someone had returned along their own route, careful to leave a trace subtle enough to mislead anyone relying solely on conventional observation. Whimsy allowed himself a quiet chuckle, appreciating the ingenuity of the effort. It was, of course, the very sort of red herring he had anticipated, the construction of an obvious suspect through deliberate misdirection. The young nephew's anxious demeanor, the chambermaid's evasions, and even the cousin's polite intrusions were all components of the tableau, designed to invite suspicion while concealing the true pattern of action. Later, he conducted a more detailed conversation with Harold Brierley, using casual, seemingly irrelevant inquiries as probes. "Tell me, Harold," he asked lightly, "did you notice any subtle discrepancies in the way the clock struck last night? Or perhaps in the alignment of the curtains in the hall?" Harold flushed, the fingers gripping his teacup tightening. I can't say, Lord Peter. I was preoccupied." "Ah," Whimsy murmured, archly. "Preoccupied, yes. One's attention often wanders during moments of emotional strain. Yet attention, even fleeting, leaves traces. The question is whether those traces are obvious to all, or visible only to the observant eye." By the late evening, Whimsy had begun to assemble a tentative sequence. The footsteps with no echo, the ajar window, the candle extinguished in haste, the faint metallic scent, the soil traces, and the displaced rug were no longer isolated anomalies. They formed a coherent chain of deliberate action, executed with care and yet punctuated by human imperfection. The timing of each movement, when compared to the statements and alibis of the household, revealed subtle contradictions, gaps in attention, and the careful manipulation of perception. He allowed himself a quiet reflection. The red herring had done its work, drawing attention toward those whose guilt appeared obvious, while the true pattern, elaborate, meticulous, and psychologically informed, remained obscured beneath layers of controlled behavior. Whimsy felt the thrill of proximity to discovery, the delicate excitement that accompanies the alignment of seemingly trivial details into a revealing sequence. As the household settled into uneasy slumber, Whimsy lingered in the hall one last time, gazing at the extinguished candle, the ajar window, and the polished floors that betrayed subtle movement. Each observation was a note in a hidden symphony, a carefully orchestrated sequence of human intention. And already, in the quiet logic of the evening, he sensed the emergence of the final acts, where revelation would follow not from speculation, but from the inexorable unfolding of precise observation and human psychology. The following morning brought an almost tangible tension to Brierley Manor, as though the house itself had absorbed the scrutiny of the previous days and now anticipated further examination. Whimsy moved among the household with careful purpose, observing the smallest gestures, the minutest hesitations, and the way each individual navigated the familiar spaces with unease. Even the clatter of breakfast silver seemed amplified, each sound betraying nervous rhythm or inadvertent attention. He began with Harold Brierley, whose restlessness had grown steadily more pronounced. "You slept well, I trust?" Whimsy inquired lightly, though the question carried the weight of observation. Harold's hand trembled slightly as he poured tea. I believe so, Lord Peter," he replied, glancing nervously toward the eastern corridor. "Was quiet, mostly." "Mostly quiet," Whimsy repeated, tapping the edge of his cup with a gloved finger. "Curious phrase. One often finds that the quiet is disturbed only in ways that leave traces most observers overlook. Did you notice anything? Unusual smells, perhaps, or a fleeting sound?" Harold's flush deepened, and he fumbled with the saucer. I cannot say. I thought I heard something, perhaps footsteps, but I cannot be certain." "Ah," Whimsy said, his tone light yet pointed. "Certainty is the privilege of hindsight, and even that is sometimes deceived." He allowed the words to linger, observing the subtle tightening of Harold's fingers and the slight avoidance of his gaze. Moving through the corridors, Whimsy inspected each anomaly again, from the ajar window in the east corridor to the displaced rug in the west wing. The pattern of movement was now sufficiently clear to indicate deliberate orchestration. Someone had traversed the house with purpose, leaving traces designed to mislead, yet with small imperfections betraying the true sequence. The metallic tang in the air, the candle extinguished with deliberate haste, and the soil smudges along the parquet floor were now seen not as isolated curiosities, but as sequential elements in a carefully concealed plan. He paused near the library, where Mr. Strathmore had been reviewing some legal documents. "Tell me, Mr. Strathmore," Whimsy asked lightly, "did you happen to observe anything unusual last night? Perhaps the chiming of the clocks or the alignment of the curtains?" Strathmore's eyes flickered briefly, a micro-expression of hesitation that passed almost imperceptibly. "No, nothing, Lord Peter. I was engaged in my papers." "Of course," Whimsy replied softly. "Engagements have a curious effect on perception, do they not? One may remain occupied while subtle movements occur unnoticed, yet those movements leave marks visible only to the careful observer." By midday, Whimsy had begun to reconstruct the events of the night with a precision that would have seemed obsessive to the casual eye. Footsteps that made no echo, candles extinguished with haste, soil traces, displaced rugs, ajar windows, and minor inconsistencies in testimony all coalesced into a timeline of deliberate action. The patterns suggested a performer skilled in misdirection, someone capable of manipulating both objects and people, creating appearances meant to focus suspicion elsewhere while concealing the true movement. The household, meanwhile, exhibited the predictable tension of those under scrutiny. The chambermaid fidgeted with cushions, the housekeeper overcorrected the placement of silverware, and Harold Brierly's nervous energy radiated in small, telling gestures. Each acted under the constraints of social propriety, yet their gestures betrayed the underlying structure of fear and deliberate concealment. As evening fell, Whimsy allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection in the drawing room. The red herring had performed admirably. It was now evident to him which figure had drawn attention through obvious agitation, while the true orchestrator remained concealed beneath the surface of ordinary politeness and controlled movement. All that remained was to observe the interactions with subtle precision, to allow the inconsistencies, gestures, and traces to reveal the hidden architect of the nocturnal movements. He smiled faintly, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. The stage was set, the actors in place, and the sequence of events, while still incomplete, was beginning to illuminate itself through the careful study of human behavior, timing, and the inevitable imperfections of even the most deliberate design. Soon, he knew, the carefully constructed illusion would begin to crumble, revealing not the obvious suspect, but the hidden mind that had orchestrated the night's disturbances with meticulous care. Night had settled over Brierly Manor with an almost tangible stillness, the house itself seeming to hold its breath in anticipation. Whimsy moved through the corridors with his accustomed quiet deliberation, eyes noting every shadow, every subtle disturbance in the familiar order. Each step, each pause, was measured, each observation catalogued and aligned against the evidence gathered over the preceding days. He paused again by the ajar window in the eastern corridor. The scratches on the catch, the faint smudge of soil on the sill, the subtle deformation of wax in the hall candle, these were no longer isolated anomalies. They formed a coherent pattern of deliberate motion, carefully planned, yet imperfectly executed, revealing a mind that valued precision but was still human. Whimsy retraced the West Wing corridor, crouching briefly to examine the slight ridge in the rug, noting the direction and pressure of the movements that had disturbed it. Here, the choreography of the night's events became clearer, a sequence designed to mislead, to construct suspicion around one figure while masking the true actor. He smiled faintly, appreciating the ingenuity of the misdirection. He called Harold Brierly into the library under the pretense of discussing household matters. The young man arrived, pale and restless, fingers tightening nervously around a teacup. "Harold," Whimsy began lightly, "one notices that the smallest details often betray the greatest truths. For instance, the alignment of a chair, the chiming of a clock, or the exact position of a candle can speak volumes if one listens carefully." Harold swallowed hard. I suppose, Lord Peter. Indeed," Whimsy interrupted gently. "It is not the loud or obvious actions that reveal intent, but the subtle, almost imperceptible ones. Movements retraced, windows left ajar, footprints that appear and disappear. These speak more clearly than words, do they not?" The young man's shoulders stiffened, and his eyes flitted toward the window he had passed countless times without noticing the evidence it bore. Whimsy allowed the silence to press just long enough for the tension to manifest, each heartbeat a small confession. Later, in the drawing room, Whimsy orchestrated a seemingly casual discussion with the household. Clocks, curtains, furniture arrangement, all trivial matters on the surface, yet carefully chosen to provoke reaction. He observed closely. The chambermaid's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted cushions. The housekeeper overcorrected the placement of silverware. Even Mr. Strathmore displayed subtle tension, a fleeting flash of unease that spoke louder than his carefully measured words. The puzzle now came into focus. The red herring, the nervous nephew, the anxious chambermaid, the attentive relative, had drawn attention precisely because their reactions were expected. Yet the traces, the micro-details, and the inconsistencies pointed elsewhere. to someone manipulating perception from behind a veil of propriety, exploiting fear and social decorum to conceal their true actions. Whimsy allowed himself a faint, arch smile as he arranged the night's evidence in his mind. The footsteps without echo, the candle extinguished with deliberate haste, the displaced rug, the soil on the parquet, the ajar window, and the subtle contradictions in testimony all cohered into a single, intelligible chain of events. And at the center of it, not the obvious suspect, but the hidden mind orchestrating the nocturnal movements, exploiting the household's civility to mask intent. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Whimsy withdrew briefly to the library, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes glinting with anticipation. The evening would soon provide the opportunity for a careful revelation, a subtle test, a reenactment of movement, a question designed to elicit reaction. The illusions maintained by social etiquette, by fear, and by deliberate misdirection were ready to unravel, one observation at a time. The house lay in stillness, yet in that stillness, Whimsy sensed the approaching crescendo, the moment when the careful lattice of deception would crack, revealing the truth hidden beneath the polished surface of Briarley Manor. The final acts, he knew, were imminent, and all that remained was to watch, wait, and let human behavior illuminate what subtle traces alone could not yet declare. The night deepened into a velvet stillness, broken only by the faint ticking of clocks scattered through Briarley Manor. Whimsy lingered in the shadowed drawing-room, his posture relaxed, yet every sense attuned to the smallest shift in the house's quiet rhythm. The traces of the previous nights, the soil on the parquet, the ajar window, the displaced rug, were now not merely curiosities but signposts in a carefully constructed plan, one designed to manipulate attention and misdirect the inexperienced observer. He allowed himself a small, arch smile. The household had performed beautifully, each individual playing their part in the tableau, unaware that the true architect moved unseen among them. The obvious suspect, anxious, flushed, nervous, would take the blame in the eyes of those inclined to see only the most apparent evidence. Yet Whimsy had long ago learned to look beyond the obvious, to perceive the subtle interplay of motive, opportunity, and human psychology. To set the stage, he invited the household into the library under the pretense of reviewing minor matters of routine. As they assembled, he began with casual remarks. The alignment of the chairs, the chiming of the clocks, the position of a recently extinguished candle. Each statement was carefully chosen to elicit response, to allow the character's own reactions to reveal what the evidence alone could not. Harold Briarley shifted uneasily, his fingers tightening on a chair arm. The chambermaid's eyes darted nervously toward the window. Mrs. Fenwick straightened in her posture with an almost imperceptible tension. Even Mr. Strathmore displayed a flicker of unease, a micro-expression that spoke of restrained attention. Each reaction was a note in the symphony Whimsy had been composing in his mind, and now it would crescendo toward revelation. "I trust we may all agree," Whimsy said lightly, "that a house, however ordered and polite, possesses a remarkable ability to betray its occupants to a keen observer. Footsteps, the movement of furniture, even the extinguishing of a candle can speak to events one might otherwise wish forgotten." A faint murmur ran through the assembled group, each person instinctively aware of the double meaning beneath his words. Whimsy allowed the moment to linger, watching subtle gestures, the quickened breath, the shifting weight, the tightening of hands, all of which betrayed consciousness of acts previously concealed. He began reconstructing the sequence, not with accusation, but with meticulous exposition. Step by step, he outlined the chain of movement, the approach along the west corridor, the precise handling of the window catch, the calculated extinguishing of the candle, the retracing of steps along the rug to mislead casual observation. As he spoke, he observed the faces before him, noting reactions, contradictions, and subtle signs of recognition or fear. And then, with the smallest, most arch of smiles, he drew the final thread together. One might look at this young man's evident agitation, the chambermaid's nervous demeanor, the relative's polite concern, and see the hand of guilt plainly. Yet the evidence, when considered in its entirety, points elsewhere. It is not the obvious actor who orchestrated these nocturnal movements, but another who has used the house, its inhabitants, and even their very fears as instruments of concealment. A tense silence followed, broken only by the shallow intake of breath and the occasional shuffle of feet. Whimsy's eyes, bright and knowing, swept the assembled faces, noting who had understood, who had recognized the subtle exposé, and who remained blind to the design. The house itself seemed to lean forward in anticipation, as if eager for the secret to finally surface. From the corner of the room, a subtle reaction, a tightening of the jaw, a brief glance toward the window, the faintest tremor in a hand, confirmed his conclusion. The true architect, cloaked in ordinary civility, had been revealed not by a single dramatic act, but by the careful accumulation of overlooked details, the predictable slips of human psychology, and the quiet, inexorable logic that always guides the observant mind. Whimsy allowed the pause to stretch, letting each person sense the inevitability of the revelation, before he prepared to lay bare the full sequence of events, with its hidden motives and meticulously calculated misdirections. The moment had arrived when the carefully constructed illusion of order and innocence would finally unravel. Whimsy rose from his chair, the faintest arch in his brow, and moved slowly around the library, allowing his presence to command attention without force. "The house, as I have observed," he began, "has spoken to us in subtle ways. A window opened with care, footsteps retraced, a candle extinguished with haste, soil disturbed along the corridor, a rug shifted just so, all details trivial in isolation, yet when considered together, revealing a choreography of deliberate design." He paused, letting the words hang, his eyes sweeping over the assembled faces. Harold Brierly fidgeted. The chambermaid's hands twitched nervously. Mrs. Fenwick's composure wavered ever so slightly, and even Mr. Strathmore displayed the faintest sign of recognition, a muscle twitch, a tightening of the jaw. The signals were quiet, almost imperceptible, yet for Whimsy they were as clear as a bell tolling midnight. "The obvious suspect," he continued, "has, of course, performed admirably as a decoy. Agitation, nervous glances, inconsistent statements. One could almost believe that these signs pointed to guilt. Yet, as is often the case in such matters, what is most apparent is seldom true. The movements, the traces, the inconsistencies all point not to the one who appears guilty, but to the one who manipulates perception with subtlety and calculation." Whimsy allowed a moment's pause before delivering the final, decisive observation. "Consider the alignment of the curtains in the east corridor, the slight ridge in the rug, the precise smudge of soil on the windowsill, the extinguished candle's deformation. Each element, carefully examined, reveals a mind both precise and deliberate. One who understood the psychology of the household, who anticipated reactions, and who orchestrated movement not for haste, but for concealment. And in this orchestration, the hand that directed the night's events becomes unmistakably clear." There was a sharp intake of breath, a nearly imperceptible shift among the gathered group. Eyes widened, bodies stiffened, and a subtle tremor betrayed recognition. Whimsy's gaze, cool yet penetrating, rested upon the true orchestrator, whose mask of ordinary civility had begun to slip. "You see?" Whimsy continued, voice measured and calm. "The truth is not discovered in the glaring obviousness of guilt, but in the quiet imperfections of deliberate design. It is revealed not in confession, but in the involuntary gestures, in the small, telling contradictions, in the traces left behind by the careful hand of one who believes themselves unseen." The orchestrator faltered, a flush rising to the cheeks, a hand quivering slightly at the side. The illusion of control, so meticulously maintained, now showed fissures. Denials rose instinctively, weakly, almost comically, but the evidence, the choreography of the house itself, could not be countered by words alone. With an arch smile and the faintest glint of triumph, Whimsy allowed the revelation to settle over the room. He spoke no more than necessary, letting the sequence of observations and human reactions do the work. The truth, long hidden beneath layers of social convention, misdirection, and fear, now lay bare. A mind had guided events with precision, and the illusion of randomness and innocence had crumbled under patient, logical scrutiny. The orchestrator's final gasp, a whispered protest, hung in the air, followed by a sudden resignation. All at once, the household understood the extent of the deception, the subtle manipulations, the careful misdirection, the exploitation of fear and etiquette. The chain of events, once opaque, now revealed itself in full clarity, the hidden design finally illuminated by the inexorable logic of observation and deduction. Whimsy, standing in the quiet triumph of his revelation, allowed himself the smallest, arch smile. He had guided the household to the truth not by confrontation, but by the careful, deliberate unfolding of evidence, allowing human nature, imperfection, and meticulous observation to reveal what had been concealed. At last, the silence was complete, the denouement absolute. The house, its secrets unveiled, seemed to exhale a long-held breath, and Whimsy, with characteristic elegance and a faint, dry wit, prepared to take his leave, leaving the household to grapple with the revelation, their illusions undone and the hidden hand of the night exposed in quiet, inexorable clarity.